Oh, okay.
Now it says live.
Now it says live.
So, hello everybody, if you can see me.
And I'm going to try to turn my camera back on. The internet where I am is very unstable. And I'm not even sure where they're using Ethernet cable. I'm like, no idea where any of the hardware is in this. Place. So I am just going to hope for the best. And if I fall off, I'll turn my camera off to make it a little bit better. And then we will just keep going with the show like we always do. Hey, Bobby, I see people joining, so that's great. I know we have a different time today, so we're going to mix things up a little bit.
Always good to shuffle it up here.
Like keep
now that we have the daylight savings time here in the States, that's always fun.
Yeah, daylight savings time in the States, and I personally am in a different time zone than I normally am. So who knows what's happening? It's all just fun and games. We're pantsing this.
You don't know how much true that is.
Yeah. Just like I asked Grant Faulkner when we interviewed hing, the executive director of NaNoWriMo. I said, Grant, is there something that is more pantsing than pantsing? Like short thing, is that a thing? Like leggings? I don't know.
Just falling off a ship into the water. I'm not swimming, I'm just falling.
It's not as much of a dive in as just a fall in or I'm in, look what happens.
Yes.
Great. Hey, Lillian, good to see you. Hey, Linda, Bryn is here. So I see a lot. Oh no, I hope Facebook connection is working. Gareth, if you're out there in Facebook land, let us know if that's working. I don't see any. It's been giving me. Okay, I see a couple of people from Facebook joined in. But it's been giving me a run for my money today, all morning. So, all right. Now let's see. Yep. Okay. Good. We're live on the groups at NaNoWriMo with AutoCrit, as well as the AutoCrit author community, and on the AutoCrit Facebook or YouTube channel. The Nano Basement. Yeah, so there should be a post placeholder on Facebook. Elizabeth's out there on Facebook. Okay, good. Okay. Well, all of that seems to be working. We're connected. I mentioned a moment ago I have a bit of an unstable internet connection, so if you see me drop off, don't be alarmed. Kevin will carry forward with the show. And with that, I think we should get started. What do you think, Kevin?
Let's do it. I'm super excited about this. I don't know how much I'm just like, I barely sit down when
I can tell.
This is me. This is my excited face. So
to be fair, it is pretty animated for Kevin. So that's
I'm happy about it. I'm serious. I've been we're here today. As Beth mentioned, we're going to talk about science fiction and fantasy. What they are, why they are, why we in AutoCrit we just split the two of them in half. We made new genres because of it. So, super excited about it because it's one of my favorite genres to work in. Also, it's one of the more popular ones out there these days, as well. So, I mean, you can't stumble on TV without seeing the Mandalorian now. There's got Star Wars, Star Trek.
I mean, out there. Raise your hand if you're a huge Baby Yoda fan and haven't even watched the Mandalorian yet. That's me. Yeah. So cute, so cute.
And Game of Thrones took over. Was it HBO? It was on.
Oh my gosh!
Took over a couple of years ago.
Absolutely, and I have a very soft spot in my heart for Battlestar Galactica. Loved it. So yeah, I think Kevin and I were talking earlier. How much do I personally know about science fiction? And I said, it's fiction with science in it, so not a lot. But it turns out maybe I know a little bit more because of television and movies than what I was thinking. So that's really interesting. As Kevin mentioned, within AutoCrit, one of the genre you can compare or benchmark your work with is or was and still is, spoiler, science fiction / fantasy. And while there is some commonality across those two genres, there are also some very unique differences. So we at AutoCrit decided to go ahead and split those so you can get a little bit more detailed in your benchmarking at the genre level between science fiction and fantasy. But we also still left the combined genre. So if that's what you've been benchmarking against and watching your score improve and you want to stick with that blended genre, that is definitely still there. But today we want to talk about we're going to talk about kind of why we split those and what the differences are between science fiction and fantasy. And before we jump in, Elizabeth, I'm with you. I'm waiting on the next George R.R. Martin books, the next two. Look, I think it took him 10 years to write the last one. So
you can get away with that with a name like that now. You can take as long as you want to write the next one.
It's true. It's true. Have Beth R.R. Power. That doesn't really flow, does it? So not everyone can pull that off, but I think yes, I too am anxiously awaiting the next George R.R. Martin book, the next Brandon Sanderson book, which is coming November the 18th or so, 17th.
17th, I think 17th is out there. Maybe the 16th for our friends in the UK. So
even better. So huge Brandon Sanderson fan. So absolutely on the actual edge of my seat for that. That being said, we are going to do, I think, Kevin, is this still correct? We are going to grab a copy of that new Brandon Sanderson book and do a deep dive live. What's the score live for that book as soon as it comes out? So
same day it comes out. So we're pretty, it's one of those things where we're not sure what we're going to find yet, but it's going to be fun no matter what.
Oh, that's definitely going to be fun. So, hey, Leite, good to see you. Without further ado, Kevin,
let's get into it.
Pull your screen up there.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and throw my screen up real quick. You can keep me on the side or however you like to see both.
Aside of Kevin, that's also always good.
Just so I don't have to pick my nose now while I'm looking around.
Be careful, you're still on camera.
So science fiction and fantasy, super exciting genre. It's obviously really hot. A lot of people writing it, and a lot of people that write, say, romance also have elements of science fiction and fantasy. There's a lot of crossover with these groups because there's so, it's interesting, right? That's the whole point of writing something, is to write something interesting. So there's a lot of things you can bring into your story that can kind of excite and hook people. It's like, wow, I really want to know more about that spaceship or whatever, like time travel. You can kind of bring in small elements, or you can go full-blown hardcore science fiction and have the whole thing be about science. But a lot of people have elements of it brought in. So that's kind of why we find it throughout all the genres of fiction. But here, we thought about doing this little series on it, or a little course on it here. It came to mind that we can't cram everything in to 1 hour to talk about entire science fiction fantasy. Not going to be possible, right? People write whole year-long lecture series and stuff on how to do these things and what to look for and how to write it. And so we're definitely not going to cover, spoiler here, everything you need to know about science fiction and fantasy in this 1 hour. I can guarantee you that. But what our goal here is to help you maybe understand some of the peculiar nuances of science fiction and fantasy, and especially how it pertains to the revising and editing, which is what we specialize here at AutoCrit. Like, what do you have to look for? What are the things you have to be kind of concerned about, as maybe not so much in some of the other genres? If you really have something that's pretty hardcore into the science fiction and fantasy, what do you want to look for? What are the red flags, you could say, that could appear when you're doing your editing and your revising and your polishing to try to make sure that this is an enjoyable read to your reader? Because obviously that's hopefully your goal anyway out there. So I think that's the primary focus here, is maybe give you a few nuggets of things. Maybe it's just obviously this is going to be the tip of the iceberg, but maybe some of these nuggets or granules that fall into your bowl would be interesting to eat, so you can learn something from it. I'm not sure that was a good analogy. What do you think, Beth? Maybe she dropped off. Sorry,
I think we can make that work. I'm going to turn my camera off because I think I had a little glitch in the matrix over here. So I'm going to try to still be here and turn my camera off and see if that helps. But I think you can make any analogy work, Kevin. That's the beauty of being a creative being. Just go for it.
True. Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, let's jump right in. And I know, this is real basic, but I think it's important because I don't know that people think they might know and people think they don't know, but these are really loose, big genres. So I just want to take 1 minute and say, what is science fiction, right? I think it's important to look at. So obviously science fiction uses elements of science. It has a focus on the science and kind of how things work from a scientific perspective. Now, it doesn't have to actually be true. These aren't, Newtonian laws of physics or something like that are actually hard, fast. But the closer you get to reality with it and you kind of bend it a little bit or push it past what we currently know or currently think we know, for that matter, the better off you're going to be with science fiction, right? So it's always got to be based in some sort of science reality or at least attempt to do such. And
so it could be, oh, I see. Okay, great. I'm probably going to be jumping ahead the whole time because I have a lot of questions. The elements of science, like we mentioned space, and that's a really easy one to think of. But it all, for me, comes to mind with physical sciences, medicine, and stuff like that. So all
cloning, you got the medicines, the cloning. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Anything dealing with scientific principle. Could be medical science, could be astrophysics, it could be computer science, it could be a lot of different things that come into it, but they're all kind of based in the science realm. Even in biology, I guess you could even say something like Jurassic Park, is a science fiction, right? Because they cloned dinosaurs out of something found in mosquito blood and amber. Right. So anyway, stuff like that, that's all elements of science fiction. That's why it's such a big, broad category. But really, along with the science, you got to bring the technology, right? For the most part, you can't just have science stand alone. You can, but typically it also involves, applied sciences. What do you do with that science? You got to put technology to it. You build an AI robot. You build a computer system that takes over the world, and something like Terminator. All these kind of things usually have an applied element of the science that you're talking about with some sort of technology. It's doing a lot of the work. And for whatever reason, I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's interesting. Science fiction typically explores dystopian themes, and what we mean by that is the future's not always grand, right? Usually, it's not a good place. There's an empire involved that's taking over, or I don't know. For whatever reason, there's a lot of, maybe most science fiction too, trying to uncover different political elements on power and corruption and whatever. But typically, the future is not bright. I don't know why, but there's always a small group of people that are trying to overthrow the evil empire, right?
Right. Well, and I think there's also that classic juxtaposition between wanting technology to make our lives easier and science and all these advances that everyone wants to really believe that there's such great things, but when it turns out to be not the case, i.e. that dystopian future thing, it tugs at you because most people probably want advances in science and technology, but it could also be easily imagined how those could go wrong.
Definitely, and it's also interesting, right? That's the whole point. That people would like to read about it. If it was a utopia and everything was wonderful and it was like the Garden of Eden and everything was perfect, then how much conflict can there be? How much strife? How much? Where's difficult? What hill are you having your protagonist climb if everything's perfect? So it makes it easier from a story arc and a character arc perspective on giving challenges to overcome. For sure. Maybe it is a utopia that all of a sudden was invaded by some sort of alien race like the Borg or whatever. Like there's a million different analogies here, but then it turns into something other than utopia. So, but typically it's kind of that usually a part of the angst in the conflict is driven by the dystopian fact that the future is not always grand. So that's all I'm going to go into it because obviously we can talk about what is science fiction over and over again. A good way to look at it from my perspective, when we start getting into the editing and revising element, like what type of science fiction are you dealing with? There's a typical hard and soft scale. So the harder side of the science fiction has sets of rules. Like you're really adhering to the laws of physics, or you really you have a certain set. Like maybe an iRobot, the robots have a code that they have to, like the laws of of whatever. I can't remember what they called it in that as it got them up, but there's a certain set of rules that things follow, and they follow it consistently. You know about a lot of things. You know how the heart pumps, or you know, like I said, how the space. You spend a lot of time in your story describing warp drives and how they actually work, and maybe they use hydrogen as a fuel source. So you go into details, and there's laws and there's rules. Okay, this is how things work. Versus the softer side of things, maybe an alien race comes and lands on Earth, and you don't really know what their technology, but they're advanced, but you're not sure why. You don't just spend a lot of time describing, how the predator's eyes can see in infrared. It's just they just do it. You don't spend time in your novel, your work, going into the details, and there's no rules. And then all of a sudden, new things will pop up, like I didn't know that person could fly, or something like that. So there's the hard side of rules and the soft. Now, as I'm going to go through a while back, as we go through this, I'll go through why that's important to remember. Like a lot of times you'll have a mix of the two, and where you shift your information as the author from a soft to a hard, and maybe hard to soft, it's important where you pull that into your story so you don't lose your reader in the process, because there's certain expectations that are set, especially when you get into something science fiction. Like your reader anticipates, okay, they're giving me details here, I got to pay attention, or this is how this is going to work. So certain I guess tips and tricks you can go about with doing that in tried and true methods, so you don't lose your reader. But anyway, I'll jump into that later. Let me jump on to the next one. What is fantasy? So fantasy, I think it contains mythical world and mythical creatures. Dwarves, elves. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of science involved with it. It's typically done maybe in the medieval ages, but doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be on a different world. But it's typically done in a place where there's not a lot of science and technology, or any at all for that matter. It's pretty much medieval, where they have swords and armor and magic. Sometimes you might get something where they throw in some gunpowder, maybe some cannons, a little bit, but for the most part, you're dealing with things from the primeval medieval ages without a lot of technology, right? And they don't really talk about it. It's not the focus point of it. It would not be the technology, but more typically the mythical world and mythical creatures. And that's kind of the next thing here. They often possess magic. Magic is usually a big component of fantasy of some sort. Magic or powers that people don't quite understand, things of that nature. And if you think about it, the science fiction has that too, because like, what about the Force in Star Wars, or, you have a magic system, but then in science fiction, you usually have a science system, something that kind of the laws and rules. So you can have a lot of the same type of elements, but they're just different. In this case, magic is typically, can't really explain it, or you can try to explain it in your novel if you like. And it usually plays a large role, though, that certain people have certain powers that other people do not, that are special, that makes them unique, or, obviously it drives a lot of the story arcs and the plots and most of the fantasy.
No, I think also, it does often contain that mythical world and mythical creatures, but there is a subgenre, maybe officially subgenre or not, but that is kind of set with a modern landscape in a modern world, but there's the aspects of, I have an author friend of mine who writes about the devil and his secretary, the devil's assistant, for real. And it's so great, but it is very modern, set in modern times, 2018, 2020. Hopefully
Yes.
not 2020, but because there is this mythical underworld, it's like a bit of both, and it helps to kind of offset those. And then the devil himself can come to the earth, and she can go to the underworld, and there are just so many aspects of that. I love it, and that might get into more of an urban fantasy kind of thing.
Exactly, and that's the blending of these genres. Like there's the true hardcore fantasy, which we're going to get here. They have fantasy scale the same, and you have the softer fantasy, where you don't really might not stay as true to the genre as you would perhaps a hard fantasy. And once again, it typically evolves where you are on the scale on detail. Like, how detailed is your magic system? Is it complicated? Is it, do you have to go to school to learn this magic, or is it just something you were born with that you don't quite know what it can do? Is it a mysterious force, or is it something that, okay, if I throw this thing against the wall, it's going to blow up? It's almost like you're getting more towards the science of the magic versus over here it's more the these are godlike creatures that have unlimited power. But like Superman, you don't really know what he can do. He can do anything. So you don't actually go into too much of the details in your story. And once again, the combination of these two, you're probably going to have both, right, in your story. Typically, you'll have elements that you describe in detail, what can and can't happen, and you have elements that you don't quite understand. And part of the story arc and the character arcs are obviously, in science fiction and fantasy in particular, you're trying to go from soft to a hard. And I think I'll show that. Why does this scale matter in both science fiction and fantasy? So most of the time, when you're introducing your reader, you start on the soft side. You don't quite, this is the whole avoidance of the info dump at the beginning of chapter 1, trying to tell them everything about the world, the over world building at the beginning. So most of the time you come into the world, either you were dropped into it, or you woke up there, or you did a time travel, or you flew in a spaceship to somewhere else. You introduce the reader in a soft phase, and you gradually, as the story moves along, you drive it more towards the hard side of giving them details about what's going on, why is this working, why is this happening, this is the powers that this person have, or if it's a science fiction, these are the technologies that are in place, and this is why they work and why they don't work. So generally, it's much easier path from a reader's perspective to be introduced and go from soft to the hard side. However, another flip of this whole story arc perspective is to go start it hard. You say, okay, we have artificial intelligence, but then all of a sudden a volcano explodes, and now electromagnetic radiation blast blows out all my technology. Now we're down to a society with no technology. So you started out with something that gets shifted right at the beginning, and then you have to kind of go back and try to figure out how things are working now that things have changed. If you're going to go with this story arc in science fiction or fantasy, where you know something at the beginning and then it changes completely, and then you try to build your way back, you go from hard to the soft, do it early on in the book.
Very early.
Very early. Like that could be the inciting incident. There's a lot of great examples of inciting incidents where you think the world is one way, then all of a sudden it switches. Do it early on. We
talk about starting in medias res. Median? Anyway, but really getting right in there and revealing that right away. It doesn't have to have a huge intro, build up, meet a climax, because you instantly want to A, hook the reader, and B, set the basic scene of like,
exactly,
this is where we were in an advanced technological society. Something happened, a volcano erupted, evil lords came over, whatever, and then the building back becomes the meat of your story arc, with the rising action and the climax and the falling action, etc. Exactly. The other one that I love this example of going from the more hard focus to the softer focus. I was struggling to understand how that would work. So great example, Kevin. Thank you.
Yeah, and the trick with it is do it, like Beth mentioned, is early, right? If you're going to give somebody details about how something is working, whether it be a magic system or a science system, and then you break that system, do it early. Because then you haven't built the trust with the reader yet that they believe it. If you wait to the end, like let's say you're reading Harry Potter and at the end of the book all of a sudden his wand doesn't work, that's not very gratifying to the reader, right?
Nor to Harry Potter, to be honest.
Exactly. So if something is not going to work like you have told people it will, do it early, and then you try to, and that's going to be part of the conflict. The worst thing you could do, the worst thing, there's all sorts of bad things that I don't recommend doing, is at your climactic point here towards the end of the story, all of a sudden your main character now has the ability to turn invisible. Just like that. Like, well, where did that come from? He could only, hide in the dark or something, but now all of a sudden he has this new power. He miraculously acquired this power in order to solve the problem at the climax. Is not good. So if you're making a promise to your reader at the beginning of how the world is when you're world building and stuff, and if you're going to give details on certain elements, and all of a sudden those details don't pan out near the end, you're going to have conflicts in your plot, in your story, and it just doesn't come across well. So if I love the idea of breaking rules and breaking things you've set in your reader and surprising them with twists, but avoid the twist on these other systems. I think would be a good rule of thumb, especially further on down the line. If you're gonna have a twist, maybe put it in the middle, but don't wait till the end to throw up. Oh my goodness, look at this. Just a recommendation from my point. And I think you can see that a lot when you're doing your editing and revising. Like, okay, how is this working, and where am I pulling the twist? Where am I dragging my reader along to? So anyway, I think that from an editing and revising perspective, just good to think of the scale of when you're doing details and when you're looking at pacing and other elements like that, and when you're providing your world building. How do you world build? How much detail do you provide, and where is it provided? And then make sure you adhere to it as you go through, because your science fiction and fantasy readers love the worlds. That's one of the reasons why they're doing it. They love the idea of the new technologies and ideas. So be cautious of giving them too many darlings and then killing their darlings, as far as like, oh my God, my spaceship doesn't fly anymore. Well, why not? If you do that, you really have to explain, like, why did this change? And then when you do all this explaining, it can take away from the plot and the character arcs, and then all of a sudden you catch yourself world building again, and 2 or 3 times, and it becomes a little bit of too much of a load to carry for your reader. So let me go ahead and.
The other aspect of that, when we were starting on the softer side and moving toward the hard edge of the scale, it was, as you're revealing these details and the science or the rules of the fantasy mechanisms that you have in place, when you're revealing those, it indicates to the reader that that's in some way going to be important in the future, right?
Exactly.
So
yes,
just the same way we do the character worksheets and the world building, and we don't just barf everything out there, or at least not all at once. Being very selective about what you reveal about your magic system or your technology inner workings can be an excellent way to foreshadow something that will happen later in your book.
Exactly. So let's say a tree has a metal bark that can stop an arrow. Well, you talk about it in chapter 1, and by chapter 3, the hero grabs the bark and puts it over his chest to use it as a means to defend himself. Don't just put that in there if you're not going to use it. Don't just. I hate trying to think of what some people call that, but it's like a world building virus, where you spend all your time world building and explaining all these things in extreme detail. Be cautious of doing that, and try to only explain what has some sort of relevance to the story, I guess, or what's going to be part of the plot. What kind of elements of the world is your main character going to be using or being in contact with that's going to play a role, right? Try to make I think one of the best things you can do, my computer got locked up, is try to make your world a character in your story to a certain extent. It's all about characters. You might think it's all about your world and the environment, but really it's all about characters and what happens to your characters. That's what the reader really wants to know about, to be honest with you, when it comes to the story itself. So if you can try to bring your world into that, you'll be much in better shape. Hold on there. My slideshow just decided to leave us. Are you still with me, Beth?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Well, my slideshow is not.
Well, we're going to go puppet show, interpretive dance, Kevin. Go for it. Explain to us. That is definitely sci-fi. Like, there's no amount of technology that will make Kevin do an interpretive.
No. So the next slide I was going to show was like, okay, so we just talked about science fiction and fantasy. They're obviously very similar, which is why a lot of times they're combined into the same realm of bookstores and stuff, because science fiction and fantasy, they have a lot of world building elements to them. The main difference between the two when it comes to editing and revising is the actual word usage itself. So I threw in to AutoCrit here. If you're not familiar with AutoCrit, we have a self-editing software system that we help authors write and edit their books and kind of polish them and prepare them for publication. Anyway, I threw in I, Robot from Isaac Asimov, a very famous science fiction novel. And as you can see in the word frequency side, the main words that were used here is robot, right? First law and robot. So it's the word use. If this is a fantasy novel, you're not going to see that. In fantasy novels, you might see sword or armor or wizardry, magic. In science fiction, the word usage is going to be computers, robots, artificial intelligence, spaceships, planets, you name it. Those are the kind of, so it's really they're both trying to achieve the same goal, but they're using different words to do it in their toolbox. So that's kind of what we do here at AutoCrit. We analyze word usage a lot in word frequency and repetitions and patterns. So the overarching structure is very similar, but the actual words used to achieve that are different. So that's kind of why we decided to, at AutoCrit, we have the ability to compare your work to different genres. And in this case, we still have a combined genre of science fiction and fantasy, but then we also split them out to fantasy. And then if I roll down here, science fiction. So you can kind of pick and choose your poison there, if you will. And also, it's just as important as the overall genre we find, especially with science fiction and fantasy, because there's so much overlap with some of the other romance genres and maybe Western, Western sci-fis are a big thing. Especially for like something like The Mandalorian, which just came out on Disney. So it's all Western sci-fi. But you can pick your author too. So not only can you pick, you can do L.E. I think it's Modesett Jr. As you're doing fantasy, you can pick a specific author that you know, or like a Robert Jordan, I think, is in here as well. So not only can you pick your genre you want, but if you have a lot of crossover and you're like, I really like how this author does it, you can select that specific author in AutoCrit as well and get customized results based on that selection. So it's a really fun thing to do when you get some of your stats with regard to your word usage and your patterns. And how you do different things by go ahead and compare it not only to your genre of your choice, but you can also compare it to the author. So we find that a lot of fun. So what's the big thing to look out for? I threw this in because I analyzed The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. One of the big things to look out for is pacing. It could be a big issue with science fiction and fantasy, right? Because you still want to carry your story along. You still want your characters to have inciting incidents, conflict, movement, lots of dialogue. But you also have to try to tell your reader where they're at, the world they're in. Why is this happening? So further in the past, pacing wasn't quite as big of a deal as it is now. Now that we're more of a TV generation with the internet and texts and all the screen time we spend, we're obviously reading as much, nor do we have spent as much time. So Tolkien, The Hobbit was one of the originals, kind of the pillars of the science fiction and fantasy genre in itself. Some would say that it created the modern, genre as it is today. But his pacing was fairly slow compared to today's standards. And when I threw in The Hobbit, I checked it out. The writing is great, don't get me wrong, but you find that when he's introducing, in this case, a goblin, right? He's spending all this time explaining now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make beautiful. He's telling us all about goblins and what kind of daggers and tools they use, and where they live, and the explosions. It's a huge long paragraph here, right? And this is the first time you meet him. He spends the time to, in one paragraph, dump all this information on us, so we know more about goblins before they even say the first bit of dialogue here. So this is something that was kind of more of an older style of writing, where you have to try to give all the information so then you get context. Versus, now we're so, not gun shy about showing versus telling and things like that. This is a lot of telling here, all up front. And it's not necessarily bad, but you really have to have your reader locked in and invested in your story if you're going to dump this much information on them all at once without having any action or anything interesting occur. And this is especially so in something like fantasy, that if you're talking about something that somebody probably already has a good idea about, let's say the dwarf, you don't have to spend a whole paragraph like this explaining to us that dwarfs carry axes and they usually live in mines. Unless you're doing something different from a prototypical genre element like that, don't tell me about it, because you have to automatically assume your reader will have some understanding about what type of personality or what type of character these elves and dwarves are. To a certain extent, you're actually stealing their imagination from them by explicitly telling them all this detail about that person. So unless you have to do it, the error on the side of less is more when it comes to this type of world building. Maybe all these details are important, but sprinkle them in amongst your dialogue. Sprinkle them in amongst your action. You know, you had to fight a goblin and they used a sword because goblins always use swords or something like that. If you're going to have that kind of element in there, don't spend 200 words here at the beginning of the introduction of telling them exactly how they are going to act and exactly how they looked and exactly their mentality and that they're untidy and dirty. Well, you can show that to me somewhere else. This is kind of the newer, more modern approach to it. I'm not saying this is bad, but I'm really trying to drive home the fact that it's your action in the characters and the conflict in your character arc and where they're going with the plot that's going to drive your story forward and get your reader hooked. Some of the details, you might love all these details. I think you might have, you know, notebooks full of all the details about your world and some of the elements in it. Resist the urge to give all those details to the reader. Just trust me. It's painful because I spent 5 years planning this novel and I came up with this amazing world and, you know, they had this character called the Gooblix and they're you know, they have big heads and I really want to explain about their eyeballs. But unless it's important to driving your story forward, just like it's almost, it's so hard to do because the author wants to reveal all these amazing creations that they have, and so much so in science fiction and fantasy. You really have to slap yourself in the face in the mirror or something when you see stuff like this. Like, you know what? I didn't need to tell them about that explosion. I don't.
On a need-to-know basis for this exact book that you're writing. The perspective that I try to point out to authors who are struggling with this is you have these amazing, rich worlds and characters. You've got 20 books here, you know, you don't have to cram everything into one book. So save some of that goodness and think of a different story arc for your next book and where that might fit in there, because you're right. You know, there's a lot of goodness there and let's draw it out, man. Let's not, just like, otherwise you just have people read your storybook notes and like that. Yeah.
Or it becomes like reading an encyclopedia to a certain extent, which I've seen some of the authors of science fiction and fantasy literally have an encyclopedia of, you know, an index of terms in the back of the book where you basically detail out all this information. And maybe that's okay, but don't let that detail, it's fine to have it somewhere, but try not to let it slow down your book, because trust me, you're going to lose people on some of this. People might enjoy it, but your readership is going to drop off, because these are like you know, speed bumps in the road of the story to a certain extent. So it's all important stuff, but try to mix it in, try to sprinkle it in and make it interesting. And it's not too bad, you know, but then you roll through and you see, you know, a lot of these slower paced paragraphs, and AutoCrit's great at finding things like this. And you got to look at them and say, am I doing that? Am I having that issue? And like, I don't know. And it turns out, I think, I might run the summary report here, but I do believe in this case, AutoCrit will also let us know the percentage of slow-paced paragraphs throughout the entire work, and that kind of get a good feel for it. And in this case, I do believe, as it comes up, I think it's more than the typical. Maybe. There we go.
Yeah, I'm excited to see this.
So 20% of the paragraphs have been highlighted slow-paced. Right? In addition to telling you, okay, your average word length and all that, and there's words per sentence and a whole bunch of other readability stats. Another good one to look at here, 20% have been flagged as being slow-paced. Typically these days, we're less than 10, preferably better than 5, depending on obviously your goal here. But that's kind of a target frame to work forward, I would say, to try to keep your pace moving, your story moving forward. So like I said, this is an older one. This was 1927, I think, The Hobbit came out. It's kind of amazing to think it came out that long. No. So the expectations were different, right? I mean, back then. So it kind of just something to keep in mind, though, to check is that in a lot of times when you fall into these longer paragraphs like that, you're falling into the world building trap of giving too much information to the reader. And then to a certain extent, when you're doing that, you're not trusting your reader's imagination on its own. You're kind of stealing from them to a certain, if you think of it that way, might help you in your justify cutting some of the stuff out. It's like, I don't want to steal from my reader and let them kind of picture this themselves. So anyway, I think enough on that one there, but it's something to look at in both fantasy and science fiction when you're building your world. Next one I was going to look at is more of a newer age science fiction story. And I couldn't help but throw the first sentence off here. I love that. This is Legion. I think, what is its name here? No, I have it there. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Legion, We Are Bob, or whatever. I picked this one up, and I've been reading it. I love the first line though. So you're going to cut my head off. So it never hurts to have a good opening sentence like that, to try to go, well, what the hell's going on here? So you want to kind of dive and figure it out. But the reason why I put this in there, because the next thing I want to talk about is dialogue. So when we get into all this world building and things of this nature, don't forget to have your characters talk, right? Don't forget to have people around to talk. You spend a lot of time, explaining the landscape and the trails and maybe the weather patterns on the world you're living in. Don't forget to have dialogue. Dialogue will typically drive your character's actions and drive your character arc for the most part. If you do it well, you can have dialogue be the central part, and that will help so much with your pacing. It's unbelievable. Just the fact of breaking up your paragraphs with dialogue and having people talk about things and learn as one of your characters learns as they talk about things amongst themselves could be a nice way to do it. Without, obviously, don't drop too many Easter eggs in there in your dialogue. Like, you wouldn't say that. You just, but you try to keep it natural and authentic to whatever your character is doing. But I think dialogue, bringing this in, can really, really help you along with these things. And I brought this one up because sometimes dialogue can be tricky with science fiction and fantasy. Mainly reason is you're often dealing with two different people or aliens or elves and whatever you have in your two different humanities talking to each other. They obviously, from a suspension of disbelief, probably aren't going to have a common tongue. You can try to create a common tongue for your book, but for the most part, there's always that awkward moment, like when you have the aliens come to Earth, how do you communicate with them, right? So that sometimes brings elements of uncertainness to our authors. Like, how the hell do I have this creature talk to this other creature when one grunts and the other one whistles? How do I do that and then not annoy the heck out of the reader who's trying to understand? You can't, you can't put everything in a foreign language because you got to be able to read it. So it's got to be in some sort of an English, or if you're writing in Spanish, I guess. So you got to come up with some sort of a common tongue. You got to figure out a way to justify the fact that these two people or two beings can communicate with each other. And this happens both in science fiction and in fantasy a lot. This whole duality of how do you come up with it without, obviously, not too many people out there, the readers of the world, are interested too much in linguistics that they want to have a whole chapter on just explaining how somebody learned a language or how to learn a language. So you kind of want to get past that as quickly as possible so that your beings can communicate with each other. So this is another one of those, scraping points from an author when they're doing their editing, revising. And one of the ways, in this case, this book came about it. So in this book, just to give you a heads up, the main character actually died and was brought back as an artificial intelligent being. Basically scanned his brain and they shoved it into a computer, so he became a computer. And he got sent out into space. So he has nobody to talk to but himself. So how do you do that? When you have internal thoughts, and then he actually created new autonomous figures to talk to other computers. But it was kind of interesting how he did it. So in this case, when he was talking to another computer, he used this type of formatting in his text with the brackets and the bold. So he's actually having a conversation with himself here with another element that he split off of himself. So don't be afraid to be somewhat creative about this when you're starting to talk. We obviously know the reader reads this like, okay, this person isn't speaking English, or it's more like a computer readout, right? So, but it's still dialogue. Find a way to convey it.
I like the fact that in addition to the square brackets and bolding, I feel the second sentence there, however, it is not recommended is more stilted, and that tells me intuitively it's a computer talking. So it's a slight difference in their dialect or cadence or word choice that also will give it away. I love that.
Yeah, so the reader can easily see when you read this, who's speaking. And it also gives them a great way to eliminate dialogue tags, right? So obviously this isn't grammatically correct. Your English teacher will say, what the heck are you doing? There's no period here. But it's not the point. The point is you're trying to convey your story to your reader and try to get them to understand what it is you're doing and how you're doing it and stay consistent with it. So you still see that. So he can think to himself, talk out loud, and talk to another computer all in the same thing. And you know what he's doing. Right? The old crap, the use of italics here is limited, which is great, but he's thinking in his mind, then he says it out loud, then the reply back from the computer readout. So you're having three different types of dialogue when there's only one person in the room. And it's a very interesting way to do it. So this is another good thing to do when you're reading your other works. So obviously, what we recommend people read a lot when they write. So as an author, you should be reading. So see how other people do it. Get these little tips and tricks. That really came across well. That was a great way to communicate with yourself and try to keep things clear for the reader, because that's really all it's about. Now, in the same vein, when we get into science fiction, fantasy, there's an often tendency, because we're dealing with different languages, different beings, different people, a lot different, whether you're a dwarf or an elf, we have a bad habit of putting too much italics in there. That's the one big, I'd say, pet peeve I think they're out there from editors and readers themselves, is don't over italicize things. Where if somebody is speaking, and just because they're speaking a different language, sure, you want to throw it in English, but you italicize the whole couple of paragraphs. I think I might have some examples, but I'll throw it in here. If this whole thing is italics, it's difficult to read. You are giving your reader something more of a challenge to read, because it's, by its very nature, it's not as clear and concise as your typical text. So be aware when you do that you're adding weight to your reader in that time. So keep it to a minimum. And also you lose emphasis with it too, right? Italics is almost like, I'd like to compare it with almost like an exclamation point. Don't overuse them. Everything isn't that exciting. It can't possibly be that. So
unless you're me, that everything is that exciting to me all the time. But if you don't believe me, try it. Like, take a whole page of your work, italicize it and read it, and then unitalicize it and read the same page, and you'll be amazed how much easier it is to read if it's not italicized. So that's why I recommend coming up with a new way of going about it. Do the brackets. If you're going to have a lot of it, if your character thinks in their head a lot, come up with another way. Even say he thought, and then put it in regular text. Be consistent with it, but I would say keep your italics to as minimum as possible, because it can really cause issues. I see a couple of folks in our comments that use italics in slightly different ways. Bobby says they use italics for telepathy. So exactly. Bobby just popped in and said that conversation shouldn't take a whole page. No, probably no conversation should take a whole page.
Yes.
But especially when I think about telepathy, it is, I need to get this information so quickly and so discreetly back and forth between these two beings that ain't nobody got time to ask about, how's your mom, kind of ancillary content. So I would imagine in Bobby's case that those are very short, back and forth, very snappy.
Exactly. So like this section here, for example, right, you could have, the author could have chosen to italicize every one of these things, but this is going to be going throughout the entire story, right? Think the Martian, he's talking to himself the whole time. He's the sole person on this planet. He's thinking a lot, or he's talking to a computer. You got to be, if you're going to do it a lot, and you have to do a lot for your story to work, come up with a different way than making it difficult for your reader to read it. That's what I'm saying.
Visually with eyeballs. Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of having, Linda says she uses it to show dreams and to underscore that it's a dream and not actually happening. I think there are a few ways to do that, and depending on the length of that dream, if it's a chapter long dream, then cutting chapter by chapter, and maybe even leaving a little to the imagination of the reader by not clearly saying chapter 2, the dream, might be helpful, but definitely for those small snippets that are just mental images, waking dreams, short dreams, telepathy. I love that idea still. So fantastic. But definitely, think about it. And as Linda also comments, the big wall of text idea, having a wall of italic text would be very difficult indeed. So break it up with your characters' physical movements or any sort of ancillary action, so it's not just a big page full of
Sure. Or like here you put a break, whether it be asterisks or like a chapter break, right? Treat it like a point of view shift. So literally put a break in the text. If you're going to have a section where it turns into a letter, or it's almost like a broken point of view. If it's going to be of any significant length, it's much better to just tell the reader you're breaking it, you're thinking now, or you're using telepathy. If it's going to be long, right? If it's not just like one sentence here, like where you can tell this person is thinking this thought, fine, just leave that in there. But if it's going to be an extended period, like a whole paragraph or two, consider breaking it out, or coming up with another way of notating it. Just a helpful hint on that. on that one. So the
Side
other
note,
thing.
Side note, as a kid, when everyone asked what superpower I would have, like kids do and adults, what superpower would you have if you could have a superpower? I always went between these three: flying, the ability, telekinesis, the ability to move things with my mind, which I still want, and telepathy. And then as I grew older, I realized I have such good friends now. We kind of have that telepathy thing. So now I'm going to start working on the telekinesis.
Yes.
Just make my own superpower. Yeah.
Who wouldn't want it?
True.
So back to dialogue here. One other thing. So we talked about adding dialogue and being cautious with italics. The other thing that happens sometimes when you're dealing with science fiction, fantasy, is you have, I don't know, say the invading army is walking lizards, right? And when they talk, they hiss all the time. Don't put "he hissed" over and over and over again, because it's going to get old fast. So be cautious of your dialogue tags that you use to attribute mannerisms or actions from a different species. Or maybe they have a high voice and they're an elf and they whistled or something. That's great. Say it once or twice or three times. Don't keep reminding us every time that person talks that they have a lisp, or they just don't do it, because it's going to get old fast. Don't beat something like that into their head, because you're already the reader already has that in their imagination. They built the character in their mind. It's they created it. Don't beat them over the head with it, because it gets old. Some of the words like "said" and "asked," or these are the ones that kind of fade away into nothing because people are so used to them. Just keep it to the bare minimum with your dialogue tags. And so, like this person, Homer grimaced, Garfield grimaced, I grimaced. Sure, it's not technically a tag, but
it's a lot of grimacing.
I get it. This sometimes people, it's not really a dialogue tag, but it kind of is. The intent of this is to find a attribute that you're describing how somebody is speaking, right? And so even though it's technically not a dialogue tag, it's kind of working in the same vein. This person is grimacing a lot when they talk. It's just things like that. But I've seen it before, where when you have a character of a certain bent or a nature, because we're dealing with a lot of unusual people and beings, and maybe a robot that speaks in a certain way, do it with the dialogue itself. Try to convey what is happening and how that person speaks and how they act with the dialogue itself. Don't do it with a dialogue tag. That rule is still hard and fast. I think it's a good one to stick to, especially in science fiction and fantasy, because you can develop it's like a crutch for the author, like, oh, this person just whistles when they speak, so I have to put whistled all the time. Just don't do it. Do it a couple of times or describe it some way, but don't constantly, every time that person speaks or that being does something, you have to describe the nature of it, because you're once again you're stealing from the reader and their imagination.
And I think that along those same guidelines, Bryn in our comments says, often if you state at the beginning of a novel something like this creature hisses, please don't write it just like that. That's terrible. But like once you state it and establish it, and the reference here was the telepathy, then the reader knows it. So you don't have to, as Kevin says, they don't have to be dialogue tagged as Homer hisses every time. Right. Yeah. The creature knows. People know that how the creature vocalizes. The same would apply at the very beginning of the story. If you can establish that that your characters are communicating telepathically, then they'll carry that knowledge forward. The reader has
you really have to trust your reader, and the more trust you show in them, and the more confidence you have in them, the better off you're going to be, and they'll give that trust and faith back to you. In a certain sense. So in that sense, it's an interesting relationship to think about, but you have to believe that your reader is following along with you, and don't coddle them in that sense. So just my thoughts on it. And when somebody will be out there and find something, oh, this person did it all, this famous author did this, and this book is amazing and famous. What I'm telling you here, and like all the stuff that AutoCrit's saying, is there's no right or wrong with these things. These are just recommendations. These are just patterns. These are things that we see and note that you should, especially in science fiction and fantasy in this case, consider when you're editing and looking at your work, when you're running through it. Not there's right or wrong here, but we're just trying to focus on, okay, how do you give your reader a better experience with your novel? We're not trying to change how you write it or what you put in it or your plot. We're trying to change how your word usage and the patterns that you use get a more welcoming and comfortable experience for the reader itself. And that, it pays huge dividends too. Is fancy and as your starship is also as nice as smooth your writing is if they can read about it and not be annoyed and even get to that point without dropping off to learn about it.
Right.
All that amazing stuff you put in there.
So they can see beyond the words on the page. If they're noticing the words on the page so much, they're not fully immersed in the story and the world that you've created.
Exactly. And sliding into that, my final little thing here that, obviously there's a lot more to science fiction and fantasy, but the other, I guess, thing to look at, to consider when you're writing and editing for science fiction fantasy is your character names. Just as unusual as they come from different planets, different worlds, there's a tendency to try to really make their names unusual. Funny little tildes, hyphens, N dashes, M dashes, whatever, if size matters, I guess it could be an N dash. But, it until it becomes almost very difficult to pronounce. I guess that's Heisikia here in this case.
I don't even have a guess at that.
Kai. Anyway, you follow what I'm saying.
Kendra?
When you choose your character's name, be aware that it's going to show up a lot in your story, and the reader's going to have to read it a lot. So, and they have to want to try to associate with that person and become, I know they're usual. Maybe this is a blue creature from the island of Bordeaux. I don't know. So they have you're kind of getting a bad habit though. That person's name could be Paul. It could be Luke, like Luke Skywalker. There's a reason why you kind of stick with common names. Or it doesn't have to be necessarily a common name, but it has to be easy to pronounce, easy to read, and not get stuck when you come across it by your eye. And obviously after a while, the reader, if they're invested, they're going to read through your whole story and they're going to love the name. But getting them past that first chapter, if they're coming into a wall of names like this, it's like, do I really want to have to read that name 5,000 times? And try to figure out how to spell it. So just be cognizant of the weight you're adding to your reader's job to read your work.
Yeah, I would love to hear from the community. When you see a name like the second one that's highlighted, Heisikia.
Or Maesoric.
Tell me, do you continuously, as you read the novel, try to pronounce that in your head? Or do you pronounce it once when the first time you see it and then just kind of glaze over it every other time? Like M-A-E, yeah, I know that guy. Maesoric.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it too. You can have a complicated name, but maybe it's May. You shorten it. You give them a nickname. You give them it's Poe instead of Popolakilis or something. You come up with a nickname and you use the nickname throughout. It's not saying you don't have to have a complicated first name or last name, but just be aware that when you do it and you do it a lot, you're adding weight to your reader's backpack that they have to carry on their journey. Every word you use, pretend like it's a rock you're dropping in their backpack, right? And the bigger stones are the ones that have the more syllables that are heavier and bigger, and you're weighing them down. And then some people are going to say, you know what, this backpack's too heavy to carry. I am not going to walk on this trip, right? So think about it like that. And I think you're going to give yourself a service, because the name of the character isn't who the character is. So it's kind of cool and unusual, but be aware that the character itself, that's what's going to be fascinating and exciting. That's what you should spend your creative control on. That's where you can really paint the picture. But be careful with these, because it might not seem like much, but when you start highlighting them and you start, because they're your character, so you're close to them, you think, oh, I know that name, I know it's perfect. But be aware when you first
pronounce this.
Yeah, I love my name. My name's perfect. Like, yeah, but nobody else can spell it.
Right, and we're seeing a lot of the comments on the live stream right now around, I give them an internal mental nickname. I try it once and then I move on. I skim it, or I try to pronounce it until I get annoyed, and then I give up, and then I just stop reading the book.
Exactly, because it's not what the character's name is that's important. It's what the character does. Like if you think back, see, you associate the action of the character. That's what's beautiful. That's the action, or the character arc. That's what's amazing about these things. Just focus on that. I think if you focus more on what the character is doing, then what that's really what the key to this whole thing is, to building amazing characters. And the name is not as important.
Look at this. So I was just looking at, I'm going to try to turn my camera back on. Bear with me, internet gods, smile upon me. So I'm reading from Unseen Fire by Cass Morris. And it's a hard fantasy, in my opinion. But it's also set in kind of Iberia, real places. So it's a very cross-genre. And she has the important characters and who they are. And I just saw a note from Linda, I think it was, that says that she has a pronunciation guide as well, which would be fantastic, right? So once I can pronounce it, I can lock it in.
Sure. And that goes along with the whole adding an encyclopedia, right? That goes along with that same idea of it's useful, but you're asking your reader to do work to make it happen. It is going to be
an investment from the reader for sure. So know what you're asking them for. Not a lot of maybe some readers wouldn't look at the glossary, the pronunciation guide, the whatever. So just something to be thoughtful of. That glossary, index, etc., may fall into the same camp as a prologue. And I hate to say the P word.
Don't say the P word.
I know. It's kind of like half of, you love it or you hate it. You read it every time or you never, ever read it.
Sure. So, and I know some people are like saying out there too, like, these are the things that make my novel special, though. Then the character names and that's a big part of it. That's great. If that's what you're going to put your effort in, stick with it. But I recommend only picking maybe 1, 2, or 3 of these kind of quirky, unusual things that make your novel you. Fine, but be careful if you have unusual names, unusual place names, and then you also have a really crazy world that needs, that people, the gravity is reversed, so you fly up in the air. So if you have a lot of unusual things that you have to explain and talk about, unless it's directly tied to the plot and the movement of your characters, you're gonna lose readers, because they're like, you know what? There's all this extra baggage I got to figure out to read this story and to even understand it. So pick 2 or 3 things. Don't have 10 unusual things. Then that's kind of my recommendation anyway. That's
I'm so thankful that everybody, the kitten made a surprise appearance. The stumbling point in my mind when I'm reading a book with complicated character names is, if I can get to know them other than their name, and I think someone mentioned this in the comments as well, getting to know them as the character, then I just kind of visually see the long name or the name that I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly or even trying to. I can sometimes just take in like, oh, it's that guy. Oh, it's Bob. Oh, it's Amorphous husband, whatever it is. So being able to skim through that and recognize it visually and skip over instead of being stuck on that word. So a lot of great solutions being shared, simplifying the names as the author, simplifying the names, revealing a nickname, keeping several names, keeping several names very simple, or just choosing a very simple name, or they have a family name that's not used all the time. All of those are great things to think about. I want to just skim over things I can't pronounce just in general. And if I can
those are great, because
the book, right?
Those are great.
Stumble my brain so much that it takes me out of the context of the story. So I'm spending my mental capacity trying to understand what that word is and trying to understand how to pronounce that, rather than immersing myself in the narrative, in the story, and engaging with that character's plight, rather than that. I want to be through the words and in the story, rather than trying to stumble on the words themselves. So thanks for indulging my question, community. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah, it's great, because you're gonna be reading that name a lot. That's the thing. It's not a one-time thing. So when you pick a character name, you got to remember that the reader is going to be reading it a lot. So, and they also have to identify with it, especially depending on what point of view, if it's first person or third person or whatever. If you're going to be following this character around, you have to pick somebody, that you want to be a friend with, like somebody that would be inviting to the reader to, like, what, I want to sit on that person's shoulder as they go through this journey. So just kind of keep that in mind. Even though it's an unusual character and they're crazy or from a different planet, but you have to somehow have some humanity enough that your reader is going to identify and fall in love and want to know more about this person and what's going to happen to them. I think that's the trick. So with that, I mean, obviously we could talk about this, for hours. I mean, we could.
Coming into this topic.
Yeah, and what we tried to do here was just pick a few things to look out for when editing and revising and looking at your science fiction and fantasy novel, and something to look for too when try to pick up tips and tricks when you read other people's work and how they handle these same pitfalls. Because nearly all the work out there in these genres, they have to attack these, the dialogue situation, the pacing situation, they all have to come up with a way to solve it, or something totally unique. So just kind of keep that in mind in your own writing as well, and how to handle these things. Because I think if you can solve these big issues, the rest of the stuff becomes very. I mean, these are the things that are going to separate you from the amateur or the person that doesn't know what they're doing. If you can handle the dialogue well, you can handle the pacing. You can weave in your world building into the path of your character instead of dumping it. If how you do this and how you handle these things can really separate yourself in your writing from the rest of the crowd. So I think that's why we kind of focus on it here too, because these are the things you really got to look at. Obviously, we can talk about removing adverbs and do all this, but these are some of the bigger elements I think that can really differentiate yourself and your science fiction and fantasy writing from the rest of the crowd.
Yep. So thank you for bearing with us. I know we've gone a little bit over, and as Kevin mentioned, yes, definitely we could. I know it's shocking, but we could talk about this forever.
Let me jump back on the screen here. You can throw me back in there. We went into a warp hole there.
Yes. I love that. Ripping the space-time continuum. That's right where the internet was for me earlier. So, oh my goodness gracious. So great. Like I always say, what is it I always say? I say a lot of things all the time. It wouldn't be a live stream if something didn't go a little bit cattywampus. So,
including my PowerPoint presentation, which died.
The PowerPoint, my internet kind of taking a little break there, but everything turned out terrific. Last thoughts. We have, speaking of fantasy sci-fi, we have an interview with author Katja de Becerra on Monday, November 9th. And she writes YA fantasy. It's described as genre bending. YA sci-fi fantasy. What the Woods Keep is more fantasy. Oasis is a little more science fiction because it's archaeologically based. So that's science. And as I've learned from Kevin today, science fiction is fiction with science in it. So check out our event schedule for November. Jump into that live stream interview with Katja de Becerra. Here, she is a NaNoWriMo winner, by the way, and her book, What the Woods Keep, was a fruit of her nano efforts one year. Actually, maybe a couple of years. Anyway, what else do we have, Kevin? What other reminders?
If everybody enjoyed this, well, obviously we could do more, right? I mean, that's the thing. We've in that AutoCrit, we've kind of splintered into doing some of the specific, writing help groups and things of that nature. If anybody is interested in something more science fiction genre fantasy and really want to dive into it and have like a full-fledged course or some sort of a more official seminar as focusing on science fiction and fantasy, let us know, because we're kind of poll the audience here in a little bit and see if there's a lot of interest in learning more about this stuff. Like I said, we touched the iceberg here. We hit some of the big ones, but we definitely didn't dive in as deep as there's a lot to go into the weeds here.
Yeah, so that similar to the horror course that we just wrapped up, we do a deep dive, almost like a master class, like a AutoCrit Academy sort of. We'll do the course, do it in wet ink, have writing assignments, have review assignments, very interactive, very high touch, that goes really to the next level and the next and the next. Oh, world building, absolutely.
Yeah,
would
I mean,
be part of that course. So
yeah,
yeah,
it's a lot to talk about. Which I know we didn't cover everything, and I know I'm interested, but
world building.
I'll talk about it forever.
I think I know who is on point to teach that course then. I think I just would have volunteer for.
You know what? Speaking of volunteering, I actually had no. Let's see if this works. I was going to put my helmet on, but it's my green screen killed it. I have an alien hat on.
Oh no!
All you see is
your teeth. Your
my
teeth.
So it just looks like I don't have a head. But then I outdid my Viking helmet though for. I know. Is it genre bending? This is for the fantasy side of things. I had to put it on.
This is fantasy for sure.
So put on your helmet. Come with us if you're interested. We'll come up with something for this.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right.
With that, I don't have anything else. Like I said, we're already over time.
Yes, we are. So, and with that, we will bid you farewell, and we will see you. I think we have a write-in tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be a live stream here in the Facebook NaNoWriMo group, as well as on our YouTube channel. We're not planning to flow that since it's pretty specific to NaNoWriMo and getting your word count in. We're not doing that through the broader author community, but if you're doing Nano or you just want to get some sprints in and get some focused writing time, join us tomorrow night, Freeform Friday, 7 p.m., live write-in with AutoCrit, meaning me. And I think Gareth, I think, is going to be there too. So we'll see. Fantastic. All right. Thank you, Kevin. This was really interesting. I caught a lot of your enthusiasm, so I'm ready to get back in on my Cass Morris book. I've got a while to go, but the beach is calling. No better time to read than at the beach. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.